Presentation by Mr. Martinez. Just hit the space bar to advance.
Alright, so I am basically talking about Rome's reconquest of their western territories. Quick little note, I talk about a lot of people and there aren't really images of all of them, so if you see me mention somebody and there isn't a picture of them, that's because there just isn't an image of them. Anyway, so by 508, the Roman Empire was very much not in a good place because Emperor Anastasius died, leaving a bit of a succession crisis with a bunch of lower relatives all trying to stake their claim. So the commander of the Imperial Guard, Justin, just took the throne in Constantinople since he was the only one with troops. However, Justin died just about 9 years later in 527 and left the throne to his nephew and co-emperor Justinian. Now, Justinian's first major success was ending the war with Iran in 532 by creating the Eternal Peace. And yes, I did say Iran, not Persia, because the actual Persians have always called it Iran. But aside from that, his greatest life's work was to restore the Western Empire. Like, that was his goal above all. He wanted to make the Roman Empire great again, like a good old Donald Trump. Anyway, but so...
Make Rome great again.
Yes, that was essentially his working motto.
Nice.
And he
That's
started...
a good motto.
Or at least have Romans living in it.
And he started off with North Africa. See, the Vandals had conquered Carthage in the 430s, and they quickly became the most dominant naval and sea merchant power in the Mediterranean. Now, back when the Western Empire still existed, both it and the Eastern Empire tried to make a combined effort to retake Carthage, but their whole naval force was destroyed at sea before they ever reached Carthage, in one of the worst disasters Rome ever had. But fast forward to 533, and the current Vandal king Hilderic was very pro-Roman and pro-Orthodox. However, his staunchly Arian Christian cousin Gelimer deposed him because of that, which gave Justinian a casus belli, or just cause, to go to war with the Vandals. So, the commanding general of the Roman forces was Flavius Belisarius, who at this point had already made a name for himself fighting the Iranians in the east. And so he led the invasion of North Africa with about 16,000 men, which really is not a lot at all. He really needed a lot more, but he still led this expedition anyway. And in order to distract the Vandal navy, Justinian persuaded the viceroy of Sardinia to revolt, which drove away the Vandal fleet. And at that same time, Gelimer was leading a force on the western border in a border war against the Moors, which left his brother Amadis in Carthage with a garrison of only about 6,000. So the Roman army landed south of Carthage and began marching just straight up north to the city, almost pretty much unopposed, because they treated the people of the kingdom like they were Roman citizens. So when they were about 10 miles south of Carthage, Gelimer finally put together a plan to stop them. On this road right here, the main road that's leading up to Carthage, there's a mountain pass about 10 miles south. It's very narrow, and Gelimer planned to trap Belisarius in that little pass and destroy him. Gelimer was done dealing with the Moors, and he planned to march straight up there from the southwest, and he planned to have his brother Amadis lead the city garrison out and hit him from the north, while his other brother, I believe his name was Gibamund, would place an ambush near the Salt Flats, and he would attack right from the west. So they would essentially trap the Romans from three sides. However, Belisarius was a smart guy and camped his army behind that river you see on the map right there, and sent out his cavalry to conduct reconnaissance of the area before he sent any more troops in. And part of his cavalry were Hunnic mercenaries who went west to the Salt Flats and discovered Givamund and they promptly wiped out his whole force, which secured the Romans' western flank. And then he also sent his personal 300 household cavalry under the command of John the Armenian to scout the pass. And when they got there, they found Amytas and his entire garrison from Carthage. And because the pass was so narrow, they just charged right into him and killed Amytas himself and chased the entire garrison of 6,000 all the way north past Carthage. That's 300 Roman cavalrymen against about 6,000 Vandals. So after that, Gelimer's main force finally arrived, and he found a small rear guard that Belisarius had sent out to hold the pass, and easily fought them off. And it was at that point that Gelimer discovered the body of Amytas, and it heavily demoralized him. But he was led to believe that he pretty much convinced himself that Amytas had actually fought off the Roman attack, and the small unit he was just fighting was the rear guard. But instead, that rear guard he thought he was fighting just went back to the camp and told him that Gelimer was right in the middle of the pass, and he was expecting an attack from the north. And so Belisarius, realizing that he had Gelimer right where he needed him, just broke up camp and brought his entire army across the river and attacked the Vandals from the south. And the Vandals were completely unprepared, not expecting an attack coming from that area, and so the Romans just completely overwhelmed and routed them. And thus Gelimer retreated far to the west, leaving Carthage completely undefended, and so the Romans just walked right back into the city unopposed. But of course, Gelimer wasn't just going to give without a fight. So not long after, he called back his other brother Sazon from Sardinia to join forces to retake Carthage. So they moved back towards Carthage, and Belisarius went out to meet him with only about 8,000 cavalry, and the two armies clashed on December 15th, just west of Carthage. And the details of this fight are extremely murky. But essentially, the Roman cavalry just kept charging right into the Vandal lines until they broke. And after this happened, the Vandal kingdom was over with. Carthage was now firmly back in Roman control, and Justinian awarded Belisarius with consulship for his service. And not long after this, the Gothic War began with the Ostrogoths in Italia, because up to this point, the Eastern Roman Empire officially had a strong diplomatic relationship with their pro-Roman queen, Amalasuntha, who was the youngest daughter of Theodoric. However, she was usurped and murdered by her cousin Theodahad because she was just too friendly with the Romans. And this, of course, gave Justinian a just cause to go to war with the Ostrogoths. So he called up Belisarius again and ordered him to invade Italia. But this time, Belisarius had about half the number of men that he had invaded North Africa with. And it was a very long and complicated war, but to sum it up as swiftly as I can, Belisarius easily conquered Sicilia, while another Roman army tried to invade Italia from the Balkans, but they were beaten back. And Belisarius briefly had to go back to North Africa to put down a troop mutiny before he could return to Italia at all. And so and once he did land in Italia, though, he began fighting his way up north, capturing a bunch of cities. And when he finally captured Neapolis, the Ostrogothic nobles lost faith in Theodahad and replaced him with another king named Vitiges, who was the son-in-law of Amalasuntha. So finally, when the Romans reached Rome itself, Belisarius secured the blessing of Pope Silverus to enter the city, and thus the Romans actually entered Rome itself without a fight on December 10th of 538. Well, actually, no, 536, sorry. And so, once again, Rome was ruled by Romans for the first time in 60 years since it had originally fallen. But because Belisarius had to leave troops behind in other cities to garrison it, he only had about 5,000 men to defend the entire city. And so, and in the spring of next year, Vitiges finally arrived with a very overwhelming force of about 30,000 men, and his vanguard infantry captured a small bridge to the north of of Rome almost without a fight. And thus the next day, Belisarius, realizing that this bridge garrison hadn't checked in, led his personal 3,000 household cavalry to investigate. And when they did, they were ambushed by the Ostrogothic infantry, and they were forced to fight their way out and managed to ride back to the gates of Rome. But they had been such a melee and were just covered in the blood and guts of their enemies that the sentries just didn't let them in, either not recognizing them as Romans, or they thought that if they let them in now, they would compromise the city, because now they had thousands of Ostrogothic infantry formations just charging right at them. But because the Ostrogoths were charging, they broke formation and became disorganized, and so Belisarius just turned all of his cavalry around and charged right into them and sent them running back across the bridge in a total rout. So after about a month after that happened, the Ostrogoths decided to try to storm the walls of Rome itself, and so they tried to use siege towers to scale the walls, but the Roman archers just killed all the oxes who were driving them. And so the Goths then just tried to attack the city from two sides. They sent one force to attack the mausoleum of Emperor Hadrian, which is about up here, while sending a whole other force to attack this area over here called the Vivarium. But both attacks were beaten back when the garrison at the mausoleum used pieces of broken statue to toss down on the Ostrogothic infantry trying to scale the walls. Then they just went outside the walls and countercharged into them. Whereas at the Vivarium, Belisarius made a risky move and opened a nearby gate to send out a cavalry sortie, who then wheeled around and slammed right into the flank of the Ostrogothic infantry and pushed them back. And that's what Hadrian's mausoleum looks like, just for a little reference. So after that, the Vitiges realized that he just couldn't take the city by force because it was just too well defensible, so he tried to settle into an actual siege, but he didn't have nearly as much men to completely encircle Rome, so he was only able to encircle about the north and eastern sides. And around that time, Belisarius managed to evacuate all of the women and children from the city, and then enlisted all of the remaining men into service. Now, for about 10 months, the Ostrogoths attempted to starve Rome out by breaking the aqueducts, which would have left the Romans without any power for their mills to process their grain. But instead, the Romans just put water wheels on boats on the river, and that gave them power for their mills, and thus they were able to eat for 10 months and were not really threatened. And so for the next 10 months, Roman cavalry just made small raids at night against the Ostrogothic camps just to harass them and make them very frustrated. However, the Romans were still frustrated being locked inside the city, faced with a very overwhelming Ostrogothic force. So finally they decided to break the siege in an open battle, but once again they were just too outnumbered and pushed back into the city. So they just locked themselves down into Rome, not leaving, not doing anything, not making any attacks aside from small cavalry raids, until finally Vitiges just realized that he couldn't starve them out, and he just didn't have enough men to scale the walls, so he just retreated back to Ravenna on March 12th of 538 after about a year-long siege. Now, after all this had happened, Belisarius' battle-worn army was finally reinforced by a fresh field army led by Justinian's personal eunuch Narses. However, despite the Romans now having more numbers than the Ostrogoths, they had a serious rift of command because Narses disagreed with Belisarius on strategic decisions, which led to a Roman-held city called Mediolanum falling under siege by an overwhelming Ostrogothic field army. And Belisarius tried to send relief to them, but their commanding officers were loyal to Narses and refused to go without Narses' direct approval, which Narses did approve of, but then they fell sick, and thus they arrived way too late. And when they finally arrived at Mediolanum, the Ostrogoths had had starved the city into surrender, took away all the women and children as slaves, killed all of the men, and then burned the whole city to the ground. Belisarius was, of course, obviously furious at this, and personally wrote Justinian back in Constantinople to recall Narses from command. And so the war continued for about another year, and the Ostrogoths were losing badly, slowly being pushed further and further north towards Ravenna. And so at this point, Vitiges was so desperate that he reached out to Khosrow Anushirwan, the Shah of Iran, to invade the Eastern Roman Empire to take pressure off the Ostrogoths. Now, Justinian offered to partition all the land between the Alps and the Po River to the Ostrogoths if they recognized the rest of the peninsula as Roman. And the Ostrogoths agreed to this deal because it essentially meant they could keep their own kingdom in Ravenna. But Belisarius did not like this deal at all and refused to sign because he essentially thought it was a betrayal for everything his soldiers had been fighting for about the last 5 years or so. And so he just refused to sign a direct order from Justinian. And so then the Ostrogoths offered to make Belisarius the emperor of Italia. And he actually accepted this offer. And then as soon as they threw open the gates of Ravenna and allowed him to march in, he just took the city and was like, surprise, the city is now Roman now because I'm not going to be the emperor, I am loyal to Justinian. He essentially was able to conquer all of Italia by lying. However, after that...
Let's say deception.
Yeah, well, like Sun Tzu said, all warfare is based on deception.
Yeah.
So, however, by this time in 540, Belisarius had to return to Constantinople because the Iranians were invading from the east. Now, while Belisarius was gone, the Ostrogoths, the war continued, and the Ostrogoths rallied under a new king named Totila. And the Romans were too focused on Iran to form a unified command to defend their gains in Italia. And to make matters worse, the first recorded epidemic of the bubonic plague broke out in Constantinople to such a devastating effect that a quarter of the entire population died. Like a quarter of people. So like 1, 2, 3, 4. So from Pax to Caleb, one of you dies. 1 out of 4. That's essentially the game of roulette that's played between there. And this was such a devastating outbreak that it totally wrecked the economy of the entire Roman Empire and just made their command in Italia even worse. And thus the Ostrogoths were able to essentially reconquer all of Italia. And so over the next 10 years, the Romans tried their best to defeat Totila, but they just did not have a unified command, and thus they just lost city after city. But finally, the Romans made peace with Iran and managed to recover from the plague, and thus a new Roman army under the command of Narses returned to Italia in about 551. And Narses was a lot more successful this time around because he had a lot more resources than Totila. And as he was marching north in July of 552, Totila tried to launch a hasty surprise attack against Narses, but he was just far too outnumbered, and Narses' armies encircled and decimated him and killed Totila himself. So, at this point, after this, Narses continued to fight the Ostrogoths for 2 more years as they kept recycling leader after leader, but he finally defeated them once and for all by the time, I think, roughly around 556. And once again, Italia belonged to Rome again. Rome belonged to Rome again. And it seemed like Justinian's dream had mostly been realized. However, after 20 years of constant war and a devastating plague epidemic that wiped out a quarter of Constantinople, the Roman Empire just couldn't maintain their hold over Italia, or even their new kingdom in Hispania for that long. And not only that, but the cities of Italia, all of them, were utterly devastated and destitute by the war, and people just began leaving en masse. The city of Rome itself had changed hands 3 times after 3 long battles, and it was now essentially in ruins. And after this, Italia fell into a very long period of decline. And And after Justinian died in 565, the Lombards began to conquer the entire country for themselves, and they completely ruled the country by 551, including Rome itself. The cost of the war, combined with the effects of the plague, also led to the Roman Empire losing much of the Balkans to the Slavs and the Turks in the 600s, and Hispania and North Africa eventually fell to the Islamic Umayyad Caliphate by about the mid-750s. Justinian was arguably the last great Roman Empire. Well, not sorry. As he was essentially the last great Roman emperor, or this is what a lot of historians make the case for him. The Roman Empire would never again rise to the same level of power it wielded under them. In the minds of many historians, Justinian was up there with the greatest of the Roman empires, right up with Caesar and Constantine and Augustus. And without Justinian, his successors were just not as strong-willed as him, and the Roman Empire would only gradually decline from there until the Seljuk Turks finally conquered Constantinople in 1453, and after that, the Roman Empire was gone forever. And that's all I got.
All right. Do we have any questions? Yeah. Yes.
You know how they called that area of Italy Italia, Although it wasn't officially called Italy yet, wasn't that where they kind of got its name Italy, like from Italia?
Yeah, Italia is just the Latin version of Italy.